Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hi, welcome to Ilanomics. The Indian industry wants the central government to give a fiscal stimulus. The talk is all about a fiscal package. MSMEs want a fiscal package. The economy wants a fiscal package. Economists are talking about a fiscal package. But there has been no word from the government about when or if such a fiscal package will come. What is the reality behind the necessity for such a fiscal package? Should the Indian government go ahead and announce lakhs and lakhs of crores of rupees to prime the economy? Or should it wait and watch and see how this crisis unfolds? Professor Ila Patnaik is with me, and she will answer some very important questions which everybody seems to be bothered about these days. So Ila, why is there this clamor for a fiscal stimulus in the first place?
Well, that is because of the decline in incomes that people have, but both households and businesses. Those who are in the informal sector, their incomes have gone down. Incomes of various sectors such as aviation, hotels, restaurants, many other manufacturing sectors. So there is clamor for fiscal stimulus, but I think we need to think about the question of what can the government spend and what should the government be doing.
Is the clamor justified in the first place?
See, I feel that it has to be in the context of what your resources are. So it's very easy to say spend more. I mean, I can tell you to spend more. You will spend more only if either you have the income to spend or you have the borrowing ability to spend. And I think a lot of this clamor is not really looking very carefully at the sources of revenue or borrowing, or indeed of borrowing also, because they're also assuming that borrowing can be like you can just borrow as much as you like. So I think those two things need to be kept in mind before we can say that the government should spend more. After all governments, all democratic governments would happily respond to people, to sectors, and spend a lot if the money was there. So I think that without asking that question, it's a little irresponsible.
But the government is being very circumspect.
The government is being very cautious, and I would agree and say that this is the right thing to do. In advanced economies, there is up to even 10% of deficit. I mean, the US prints dollars. It can afford to do that. Many other advanced economies are giving big fiscal packages. But can we afford to spend more? It's not just about fiscal prudence, fiscal responsibility. It's not enough to say, okay, this is a bad time. We really have to think about how this year is going to unfold, what is going to be GDP growth, how that GDP growth will determine what taxes we can collect. It'll determine how much our domestic savings are going to be, and then that will determine how much we can spend. So I think the government is rightly so being cautious, because the full year is ahead of us. We are just on the first month of this financial year.
In your column, Ila, you've talked about the two options: borrowing from India, within India, domestically, and borrowing abroad. Can you just explain the pros and cons of both?
So if tax revenues fall, what does a government do? First, that they are likely to fall. Okay, GST in March was low, and so we would expect GST in April will be much lower because it was a full month of lockdown, and that before even thinking about additional spending, even what had been planned. So for this year, 16.3 lakh crores was to come in as revenue, and the question is, will we be able to get that revenue? And I doubt that we would, because this was an increase over the previous year's 15 lakh crores, which means that, let's be clear, the government has to borrow more. Then you come to the question of where does it borrow from? So it can borrow domestically, or it can borrow from abroad. If domestic savings go down, then ultimately, let's understand that ultimately it's the saving of households, of people like you and me, of the household sector, which is small firms, of the corporate sector, which constitute domestic savings. And it is that savings that through various intermediaries like banks, Provident Fund, insurance companies, LIC, that it is that savings which is channeled to the government. This year, if our incomes go down, then those savings are likely to go down because we can only save out of what we earn. If you don't have enough savings, domestic savings to borrow from, you can borrow from abroad. So what the government has done is it has increased the cap, the amount that foreigners can, the bonds they can buy of rupee denominated debt. In previous crises, we have seen that the government, when the crisis has been an external crisis, when we've needed to import more, we've also seen governments borrow through the Millennium India bonds, Resurgent India bonds, and so on. So it can vary through whether it can be dollar borrowing or it can be rupee borrowing. Now what we have been trying to do in the last few years is to increase the rupee borrowing of foreigners, which really means that when foreigners lend to the government of India or buy a government of India bond, our preference is that it should be so many rupees that we have to return. Because if we have to return so many dollars, and in the meanwhile, because of the various things happening in the world and international markets, the rupee depreciates, then we'll have to end up giving more rupees if it was in dollars. So we've been trying to do that. So that would be one route. So you could get foreigners to buy Government of India bonds. So that would be your dollar borrowing. That would be your foreign borrowing. In addition, there could be some dollar borrowing, which would not be our preference. But if we are not able to borrow in rupees, we might like to do that. Not very advisable, but if you have a large fiscal deficit, you have to borrow from, cover it somehow.
You have to borrow, and right now the option seems like India will be forced to borrow from outside than within.
I'm only worrying, and I think that the government is worrying, and rightly so, and that's why we are not seeing an increase in expenditure and lakhs of crores announcements. I mean, all governments would like to do announcements, but we're not seeing that. I think because the worry is that what if incomes, suppose the lockdown continues, it has to be enforced partially, whether the partially is geographically in clusters or whether it is
sector-wise,
more weeks, or sector-wise, or it comes back again. Let's say it's lifted. We don't know, and nobody has a clear path. No country has a clear path of exit from these lockdowns. So I think the government is rightly being cautious and not going spending in the first month of the fiscal year to wait and see what our tax revenue is going to be like, what are savings going to be like, domestic savings. And while opening up a little bit to to foreign capital flows, usually Indian governments have been reluctant, and that again has been a consistent policy that we don't borrow too much from abroad, and if we do, then now we've started borrowing more in rupees, so the risk is less for us if we are borrowing in rupees
from abroad. But for borrowing from abroad requires certain things to be in place, and you argued very strongly about what India needs to put in place and keep in place so that its credit rating is good and it gets the inflows.
Absolutely. So if global markets are down and foreigners are looking for a place to invest, and Government of India rupee bonds are an attractive investment, we cannot afford to create macroeconomic instability. By that I mean we can't have very high inflation, we can't have very large deficits. We need to have public debt on a sustainable path. Now, on a sustainable path really means that our growth rates are going to go down, but it should not be that they go down so much when interest rates remain high, that public debt to GDP ratio starts rising. So we have to be careful that we don't get downgraded. We have to be careful that even if we want to print some money, as we've argued earlier, that yes, to some extent you might want to print some money as well. But you don't want to print so much money and have so much inflation that foreigners start worrying that the rupee will depreciate. You don't have strong fundamentals. So you need strong fundamentals to be able to attract foreign capital, for them to have confidence in the rupee, in the government, and that can allow you to do additional foreign borrowing. The interesting thing is that most of the economists who are talking about increasing expenditure are those who don't want India to borrow from abroad, have usually favored capital controls and don't want us to be printing a lot of money and having high inflation, which I would completely agree with. But I think it's very important to ask the question, so then where is the domestic savings for all this increased government borrowing going to come from?
So you're arguing that right now India is in a reasonable place and it's doing the sensible thing.
Yeah.
But how long for?
I think we have to wait and watch, and we have to continue to try to be sensible and not do very populist things. If the option is to give out large handouts compared to try to create conditions in which the economy can be revived, even if you spend an extra 1% of the economy on testing and COVID related treatment, vaccines and so on, rather than 2% on giving handouts. If that is the trade-off, if you spend more on trying to put in safety measures that can help you revive the economy, then that would be the direction in which we should be going. And I think that's what we are doing. That's what we are trying. That's why it's not like assuming that there's going to be 6 months of lockdown and then giving out large handouts. And we have to be all through the year going on this path very carefully, because if you go down into very high expenditure, high fiscal deficits, large borrowings, you may, in addition to all the trouble you already have, you may also get a macroeconomic crisis. And I think that's more than we can handle at the moment.
Thank you, Ila. Preventing a macroeconomic crisis while also fighting coronavirus is critical to ensure economic stability. Hopefully this is going to go down the right path and the flattening of the curve happens when it comes to the virus and the economy takes off in the opposite direction and goes up. That's the hope, and that's what we expect to see in the coming weeks and months. Thanks for watching this episode of Ilanomics. We'll be back with another one next week, and please do tune in and subscribe to ThePrint's YouTube channel. Thank you.